Hi, this video will be a triple feature. Polyend just came out with 3 new modules and sent them over for review. A module called Anywhere, which is a Eurorack power supply designed to let you take your setup on the go and power it using a regular phone power brick. Preset, which is a module that attempts to bring the idea of presets to Eurorack, but also does quite a bit more, including sequencing, custom LFOs, and a pretty powerful control surface. And a follow-up to a polyphonic MIDI to CV module they came out with a while back called Poly 2. This one also supports MPE, has slightly fewer outputs, and is a lot more configurable. Let's get started. If there's a specific module that interests you, you can of course skip ahead using the timeline on the left. Let's start with the simplest module, which is Anywhere, a power supply module designed to power a Eurorack setup using a USB power brick. This module comes with a USB cable to connect it to your power brick and also a flying bus board, which is a fancy name for a ribbon cable with sockets to which you can connect your modules. It doesn't come with an actual power brick. I'll link to a few of those I've tested below in the description. Alright, let's get a few power terminology items sorted out. A charger is measured by a few parameters. All these are 5 volts, so let's ignore that. But the more confusing parameters are amperes and amperes per hour, and then there's milliamperes and milliamperes per hour, all of which are important things you want to look for when you buy one of these things. In layman terms, because that's what I am, A or amperes measure how powerful a source of electricity is. If your device is power hungry, it's going to need more amperes. In an analogy to water, it's how wide the pipe is. If your gear is power hungry, it's going to need to drink electric juice with a hose, not with a straw. This pack, for example, can give up to 2 amperes, and the one here in the back up to 2.4, actually 4.8, but 2.4 on each output. So 2.4 amperes is the maximum juice or power that this thing has. If something requires more power than that, this won't be able to power it. Now, the second number you'll find when shopping for these things is AH, or ampere hour, and that's how much power your battery can store, or how big of a juice bottle it is. This charger is rated at 20,000 milliampere hours, or 20 ampere hours, meaning that it can give off 1 ampere of juice for 20 hours, or 2 amperes of juice for 10 hours. The little M before the A or the AH stands for milliamperes, which is 1,000th of an ampere, just like a milligram is 1,000th of a gram, which is good to know if you're dealing drugs, which Eurorack kind of is. So let's talk about this in practical terms. Polyend Anywhere can power modules that require up to 1,000 milliamperes or 1,000 amperes of juice of power. These 3 modules require about 790 or 800 milliamperes, especially because this one is a little bit power hungry. You could power many more modules if you picked modules that would require less power. Now, this is the slightly confusing part. While this gives about 1,000 milliamperes or 1 ampere, it requires at least 2.4 amperes from its power brick. So to give 1,000 milliamperes, this requires 2,400 milliamperes. This battery is 20,000 milliamperes. Let's just assume it was 24,000 milliamperes. You could then power this for 10 hours, right? So 2,400 per hour, 24,000 milliampere hour on the power supply. This little power brick is rated at 2 amperes and 13,000 mAh, right? So 13,000 divided by 2,400 means that it can power this for about 5.5 hours. This is, of course, assuming we require all the power that this can give us. If we require less power, potentially we could go longer. Now, all this is electronics theory, which hopefully I didn't get wrong. In practice, my tests show that you get about 20% less than the theory. If you want to know how much juice your modules need, go on to Modular Grid and check out the specs there. You can check out specs on an individual basis per module, or just look at the total on the bottom. Check out Polyend's site for the limits that they recommend. I think the total here needs to be about under 1,000 for this to work. Another important thing, apparently the length of the USB cable matters. When I first hooked this up, I didn't use the cable that came with the module, but rather a USB cable that was lying around the house. And that apparently is not a good thing, because as soon as I added more modules, at some point I couldn't get enough juice, enough power that I expected, even though I was still within the theoretical limits of the module. So use the short cable that they give you, don't use long cables. So that's pretty much it for this module. Just to wrap up the Anywhere segment of this video in terms of pros and cons. Pros are, it works if you have a strong enough power brick and if you're not planning to power too big of a system or your modules aren't power hungry. Other than that, it seems to work fine. I'm powering this entire section of my setup using this power brick and Anywhere. Now, I don't use my modular system outside the studio, but if any of you do and are aware of other solutions or power modules that work to power larger systems than what this can, please let everyone know in the comment section below. So that's Anywhere. Let's move on to Poly 2. Poly 2 is a MIDI to CV module, meaning that it can take digital note data and other MIDI information and convert it to analog control voltage to control your modular gear. There are two things that are special about Poly 2. The first is that it supports up to 8-note polyphony because it has a lot of outputs. And the second is that you can configure its parameters on the module itself rather than using a computer like some other modules. There is a little bit of menu diving here, but ultimately I think it's better than grabbing a computer and connecting it to your module. That said, other modules may have additional functionality that this doesn't, so check out feature lists carefully when you compare. On the input side, you can feed Poly 2 MIDI in one of three ways. It acts as a USB device, so you can send it data from a USB host like your computer or an iPad. It also acts like a USB host, meaning that you can connect and power a MIDI controller like Keystep and others with USB and both power that controller and get MIDI data from it. And finally, a third way to get MIDI data into this is traditional MIDI, either 5-pin MIDI using an adapter like this, or 3.5mm TRS MIDI. This supports the TRS-B standard. Now, I gave a pretty thorough explanation of the differences between TRS-B and TRS-A in my review of the Launchkey MIDI Mark III just last week, so check that out if you want to learn more about the two standards and how to bridge them with a DIY cable or a module like this. Now, I won't go over every feature here, but just to cover the basics, you've got 20 CV and gate outputs. The first 8 are pre-configured as CV and gate pairs, so it's easy to get quick polyphonic control going. In this case here, SWN or Swan from 4MS is a polyphonic synth with up to 6 voices. I'm controlling 4 of them using Poly 2 and Keystep, so I can play notes individually or play chords up to 4 notes at a time. So the first 8 outputs are always gates 1 and 4 and pitch 1 to 4. Then the 12 remaining outputs are configurable. You can use them as additional voices, so you just go into the voices menu and increase the number of voices. I'll keep it at 4 for now, but you can go up to 8, and then these will automatically map as additional gate pitch pairs in these 2 rows. Another option is just to go in and configure each and every one of them individually with custom CVs, right? So you just select one of 12 outputs. Let's just go into the first and take a look at the options. You can have this translate velocity to CV, CC to CV, clock, and start-stop messages. You could then go ahead and configure each and every one of these 12 outputs individually. Poly 2 also works with MPE devices, so if you have one like the Continuum, Linstrument, or Roll EC board, you could send out different articulation for pitch bends or modulation on a per-note basis. This, as many of these types of interfaces, also has a few play modes. Again, I won't demonstrate these in detail. The idea is that these modes let you use Poly 2 either as a controller for a single polyphonic synth, as a drum machine-like setup where each MIDI note gets sent to a different output, or in case you want each MIDI channel to control a different instrument. Poly 2 also supports loading and saving profiles, and you can panic as well, but you also have support for different types of scales, and you can change the root note, and there are plenty of scales built in here, as you can see. One question I got that I did want to address as I was talking about making this video on Instagram, the difference between a MIDI to CV module like Poly 2 and an audio interface like ES9 or ES8 from Expert Sleepers, is that a MIDI to CV interface, hopefully as you've seen by now, takes MIDI data and converts it to control voltage, so it applies some smarts or brains to it. An audio interface, on the other hand, is more of a simpler pipe, converting analog audio or voltage levels to digital and back. To slightly confuse things a bit, some audio interfaces like this one can also send and receive MIDI data with an expander, but just like audio, it just does that as a simple pipe. You'd need software on your computer to use something like this as a MIDI to CV converter, and with all the calibration associated with it, it probably wouldn't be worth the hassle. These are more appropriate just as general audio interfaces that can handle Eurorack levels, as well as my favorite use for them, which is a bridge to a hybrid modular setup, meaning combining a real-world Eurorack system and a virtual one like VCV Rack. More on that in a video I'll link to below. In terms of pros and cons, compared to the first version of Poly, this is more configurable and smaller, so that's a good thing, but it has fewer outputs if you were expecting to create an 8-voice MPE-capable Eurorack polysynth with per-voice articulation and velocity controls, which requires 32 outputs and not 20. Somehow I think that's not the common use case, so compared to other products, if I'm not mistaken, Poly 2 still leads the market in terms of the number of outputs it has. There are, however, cheaper MIDI to CV interfaces with fewer outputs, and also similarly priced options with fewer outputs but more features like FH2 from Expert Sleepers or Hair Mode from Scorp, which is also a sequencer. Feel free to comment below with your MIDI to CV interface of choice. So that's Poly 2. Let's talk about Preset. Preset is an interesting module both for what it was conceived as and due to what it evolved into. The core idea is simple, to bring presets to Eurorack, but that later evolved into a pretty unique sequencer, a custom LFO machine, and a pretty interesting control surface. Let's start with a basic preset functionality. Now, unfortunately, this module doesn't come with a robot arm that plugs in cables for you, at least not in this version of the firmware, but it does essentially save presets, or more precisely, save up to 9 voltage levels in your system and let you change them on the fly. Let me just walk you through this setup and then I'll explain how Preset helps you save states on this. In this case, I've got 3 core modules that are responsible for generating sounds. MCO is my bass drone oscillator, IO47 is a really nice filter from Instruo, and for percussion or leads or pretty much anything else, I've got Platts from Mutable Instruments. And Platts is a very flexible module with a lot of modes and sub-options, but you can't save presets on it. None of these actually can save presets, and that's what we'll be using Preset for. Before we look at this, let's just take a look at what's going on here overall. I've got a few utilities on top, including 4 robots, which is an Ornament and Crime based module, but is improved with extended voltage ranges. If you're not familiar with Ornament and Crime, it's a really cool open source project that packs a few helpful utilities like envelopes, LFOs, and quantizers, Turing machines, and more into a pretty small, nice little package. I've got noise tools for clock and random voltages, FSR for expressive control, and STEPI for gate sequencing. Now these two can save presets, so I'll be using Preset mainly for these guys. I'm making very simple use of Ornament and Crime here, by the way. I'm just using it to duck the filter every time the kick plays, right? So it's sort of like a quick envelope as sidechain for the filter. Notably absent, by the way, from this case are VCAs and a mixer. I'm doing my mixing on a computer with audio coming in from ES9, and while you can never have enough VCAs, Platts takes care of its envelope for me on its own, using its built-in VCA every time I trigger it from Preset. I use the filter cutoff as sort of like a VCA for MCO, and I'm playing a drone anyway. And this currently gives me an envelope, but also has plenty of LFOs, quantizers, and like I said, a bunch of other tools. So the way to use Preset is to give it control over any parameters that you want to be saved as part of your preset. Let me just start fresh with an empty bank. I've got all these banks full. Let's just go to this one for the heck of it. And an empty bank on Preset looks like this. Now to help me remember what's going on, I've got these 4 outputs, right, or these 4 knobs controlling the 4 knobs of Platts, including frequency here. And I've set all of these to as low as possible and all of their attenuverters to as high as possible. So that's what these 4 knobs do and what these 4 cables are connected to. Then I've got this cable to change modes on Platts, right? So I can change and play completely different instruments. And this guy here is going through a buffered mult because I want it to both trigger Platts as well as trigger the sidechain envelope. All 9 outputs, all 9 knobs have 3 modes: blue for normal CV, green for gates, and then cyan for note information. First thing I want to do is get this going, sending out a gate to trigger plats. Its levels are between 0 to 10, and 5 volts are enough to get plats going. So with gate, I can trigger any sound I wanted, right, on plats. The next knob mode is note, so let's set that to control the frequency of plats. And notes is pretty straightforward, right? Got notes going here. Notice I got a scale going on here. I could change settings by holding these 3 buttons and going through the scale options, which are here, right? And there are a few scales. Let's just say minor, right? So now I've got any note that I want to choose, and of course I can transpose it a bit using this. Then these 3 parameters control the timbre of my sound. That's pretty straightforward. Blue is control voltage. So I can change the parameter, change the timbre of the sound. And then finally, Plats has multiple models, but I can change models with this knob, right? And pick any one of the 16 models. So let's see how this works as actual presets. I can copy presets just by hitting record and touching the pads I want to copy this to, right? So now any one of these pads does the same thing. And I could go on a pad by pad basis and change any parameter I wanted. I guess the basic one would be, say, notes. By the way, it's slewing because I've got slew on, so let's cancel that. So let's set this, say, to C, and then D, right, and E or D flat, D sharp, sorry, right, so the beginnings of a minor scale. So that's one way to use this both as a performance surface and as a preset machine, but then I can go ahead and change really any other parameter. So let's change the model in this one, and the model again in this one, and maybe a bit of the timbre, and the model again in this one. Let's go for drums. Right, so this is the kick, got to reduce frequency on that. And this will be snare and hi-hat. Okay. Let's just say that this is a hi-hat. Right, so kick, snare, hi-hat as independent presets, and of course I've got my notes here. You can see how immediate this is. So to show you a few other features, I've got this connected into filter frequency, and then this into the oscillator frequency. Let's connect the oscillator into the filter. Right. So I could control the filter frequency with this knob. We already know that's easy. But a cool feature in preset is if you hit record and then press the knob, you can record knob motion or automation. So let's say I want to do this thing. Right? That was recorded into this, and it's playing back now. Now by default, this motion isn't smooth, and it's recorded at a rate of 10 Hertz, so it can get rough, but if I hit settings and turn on smoothing, right? This is off and this is on, then the motion will be smooth. I can actually make the motion faster or slower. So if I turn this clockwise, it'll go faster, and counterclockwise, it'll go slower. Okay, and to erase it, just clear it like this. You could, by the way, also automate notes like this. So if I hit record and then press this, which controls my notes, I could turn it like this, or just hit notes here. Now you could use this to create automated sequences. So let's turn this into notes, right? And then I'm controlling the oscillator frequency with this button. So if I turn up the filter and turn this, Right, I'm transposing this oscillator. So I can go ahead and record this motion, just like this, or play in notes, like that. I've just recorded this automation as a sequence. I could play it faster if I wanted, or slower. Now, this isn't very precise as a sequencer because of the sample rate, but nonetheless, it's an interesting way to get a few sequences going, and you can do this on a per parameter basis. You could, by the way, also record control voltage if you wanted as well. Another one of the interesting settings you have here is Slew, so let's bring this guy up. I've got two notes here, right, these guys, and you can see the transition is immediate, but if I hit these three, which is a little bit hard with all these cables, then turn on Slew, and you've got a slew rate of up to 5 seconds. Let's not go overboard. And the parameters will slew from one position to the other. Right, this applies, say, to the filter as well. So I put up some resonance, and say the filter in this step, I'll put it here, and then in this step, I'll lower it. Ouch. So now, I've got both motions going on together. This actually works with LFOs too. So why don't we go overboard and record an LFO automation here. Right, let's say. Okay, so I've got the automation going on here. And it'll fade out as we go to this. So pretty neat stuff with Slew. So we saw sequencing with the LFOs, but there's also a built-in sequencer. If you want to get that going, what you will want to do is set sequence length. Again, 3 parameters here, and then sequence length. By default, it's 1. I'll set it to 8, so we have these 8 crazy sounds that we saw going on before. And I want to turn off Slew, of course, because I want this to work immediately. Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to access these buttons if you've got regular cables, but I should definitely get the tendril action going on here for access to these buttons. Anyway, once I've got a sequence length, all I need to do is get a clock going into it. Let's just take this, plug that into the CV input. Now I've got to tell preset to listen in to gate signals on the input, and let's get the rate up. Right, and you can see, let's try and stress test this. Okay, so you can just cycle through presets like that. That's fairly straightforward and easy. Another way to cycle through the presets is with control voltage. So if I change this mode to CV in and say plug it into here, then this pressure sensitive pad will cycle through the presets. Now this needs 0 to 10 volts and this sends out 0 to 5 volts. So I'm going to trick this a little bit and set the sequence length to double. Now I should be able to reach the entire length of the 8 patterns with this. Now you could of course sequence these voltages or apply an LFO to them using something like Ornament and Crime or any other LFO or sequencer. So quite a few nice ways to hop around between presets here. One thing I did notice, and I'll get our sequence going again here, is that you can't mess around with parameters while a sequence is running without sort of hurting the sequence flow. Sometimes there's a little delay. Let's say if I wanted to change the models, it takes a while till this works. See these little delays? So if you want to change parameters in real time and mind a little lag here and there, you might want to get a standalone sequencer that can also control multiple parameters at a time. Let's talk about a few miscellaneous items. Preset lets you store 32 banks of 32 presets, right? There's the bank button here. You just choose any bank you want and move between the banks like this. You can actually change banks while a preset is running. You can press bank and any encoder to randomize a preset. Not sure what you'll get, but you can do that. And you can clear presets or banks and copy and paste either presets or banks. Let's talk about pros and cons. I'll start with the cons. Preset only sends positive voltages, 0 through 10 volts through its outputs, so you'll need a negative offset or attenuverter if you want to extend your voltage range below 0. Another con is what I mentioned before. If you're running a sequence and want to change parameters mid-sequence, it might get laggy or glitchy. Other than that, I couldn't find any other cons. If you can think of any, please write them in the comment section below. On the pros side, there's something quite comforting about the fact that you can approach a Eurorack system and get some semblance of storing presets or getting back to where you were, especially in a performance situation. Preset is a great way to take a setup like this and use it kind of like you would a normal synth with presets. As you move from one song to the next, you can change up to 9 parameters, which, as you heard, can get pretty material in a setup like this. On top of that, preset becomes way more than just a way to store voltage levels when you look at it as a performance surface, custom LFO, and sequencer. I just scratched the surface of the potential use cases for this. Imagine pads used to trigger samples, play notes on various modules, or to sequence multiple modules at a time. That's just a bit of how deep this can go. For more patch ideas, as well as a section dedicated to Eurorack for beginners, check out my book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below. Hit like if this was useful, and don't forget to hit the bell after you subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.